Start. Threats in this position are: bishop takes bishop, queen takes pawn, check. Here are the checks. Knight to f3, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using knight to g6, bishop to e3, knight to f4, bishop takes knight, queen takes bishop, f3, d5. One more. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, queen takes pawn, knight takes knight. There are no checks in this position. The answer is knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, f6, queen takes pawn, rook to d8, queen to e3, pawn takes bishop. Another puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are: rook takes bishop, rook takes pawn, bishop takes pawn. Here are the checks. Queen to h7, check. The best move in puzzle position is bishop to c5, f3, bishop to f1, bishop takes bishop, rook takes queen, rook takes rook, pawn takes bishop. Next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: king takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is king takes pawn, king to d6, e4, pawn takes pawn, f5. Let us go to the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes bishop, rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn, queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, bishop takes pawn, check. King takes knight. Here are the checks. Rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn, check. The best move in puzzle position is queen takes pawn, check. Bishop to f7. Rook takes bishop. Queen takes rook. Queen to c8, check. Queen to f8. Bishop takes pawn, check. King takes bishop. Queen takes queen. Another puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are: pawn takes pawn, check. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Pawn takes pawn, check. The answer is pawn takes pawn, check. King takes pawn. King to c4. King to f3. g4. King to g3. King takes pawn. Another one. The threats are: rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn, check. Bishop takes knight. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Here are the checks. Rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to g2, check. Queen to f1, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using rook takes pawn. King takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. King to e3. Bishop takes knight. Let us go to the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn. Bishop takes bishop. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Bishop to g5. Queen to d8. Bishop takes queen. One more. Here are the threats. Rook takes knight. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Checks in this position are: rook to f7, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook to g7, check. The best move in puzzle position is rook to f6. Rook to g7. Queen takes pawn, check. King to g8. Rook to f2. Knight to g6. Rook takes knight. Rook takes rook, check. Queen takes rook, check. Let's see the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: pawn takes pawn, check. Queen takes knight. Queen takes rook. The checks are: pawn takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is queen to f4. b6. Pawn takes pawn, check. King to b7. d6. Rook takes bishop. Queen takes pawn, check. King to a7. Rook to c7, check. Queen takes rook. Pawn takes queen. Next, threats in puzzle position are: pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. King to e4. Another one. The threats are: rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes rook. Checks in this position are: rook to g8, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is queen to h4, knight takes bishop, queen takes knight, queen to f6, rook to f7, rook to e1, check, king to d2, queen takes rook, queen takes queen. Let's continue. Here are the threats. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. h4, king to g7, king to e5, f6, check, king to e6, g5, g3, g4, king to e7. Let's continue. The threats are knight takes bishop, queen takes pawn. The checks are knight to f6, check. The answer is bishop to g5, knight to f4, queen to e3, knight takes pawn, check, pawn takes knight. Let's see the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn. The checks are rook to e2, check, rook to c1, check. The best move in puzzle position is king to e3, queen to a7, check, rook to d4, king to f1, rook to f2, check. Next puzzle, threats in this position are pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, king to e6, king to e3, a5. Next, the threats are rook takes pawn. Here are the checks. Knight to d8, check. Knight to e5, check. Rook to h7, check. Rook to f6, check. The puzzle is solved using knight to e5, check. King to g7. Rook to g6, check. King to h7. Knight takes rook. King takes rook. Knight to e5, check. King to f5. Knight takes rook. h4. Knight to c5. h5. Knight to d7. h6. Knight to f8. King to f6. b5. King to g7. b4. King takes knight. b3. h7. b2. Promotes to queen. Promotes to queen. Another puzzle. The threats are knight takes rook. Pawn takes knight. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is pawn takes knight. Bishop takes pawn. Knight to c4. Bishop takes knight. Queen takes bishop. Queen to g6, check. Queen to g2. Next, the threats are queen takes pawn, check. Pawn takes knight. Knight takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Knight to e2, check. Bishop to h2, check. Bishop to f2, check. The puzzle is solved using pawn takes knight. Rook to b7. Rook to f8. c6. Queen to e8. Queen takes pawn. Rook to f7. Queen to g6. Rook to e7. Queen takes queen, check. Rook takes queen. Another puzzle. The threats are rook takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes knight. Pawn takes knight. Pawn takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Checks in this position are rook takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using pawn takes knight. g6. Rook takes pawn, check. King to d1. Rook takes knight. Next, threats in this position are queen takes pawn. Checks in this position are knight to d6, check. Knight to f6, check. Solution to the puzzle is f4. Bishop to f6. f5. Another one. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are bishop takes knight. Queen takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is bishop takes knight. Pawn takes bishop. Queen to d2. King to h8. Queen to h6. Rook to g8. Queen takes pawn, check. Another one. Here are the threats. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using king to b4. King to c6. King takes pawn. King to d5. King to b3. King takes pawn. King to c2. King to c4. King to d2. Let's continue. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is f5. Pawn takes pawn. King to d4. f4. King to e4. King to e2. King takes pawn. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook to d7, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is e5. King to g6. Pawn takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Rook to d5. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.